Hello, here I am again in the name of the sovereign creator of heaven and earth, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're continuing with my exposition of my translation of 1 Corinthians. We are in chapter 8 and have come now to verse 7. Reading therefore 7 through 13. However, this knowledge is not in everyone, but some with consciousness of the idol still eat it as offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. But food does not commend us to God, for neither if we eat are we better off, nor if we do not eat are we worse off. But take care lest somehow this right of yours become a stumbling block for those who are weak. For if someone who is weak sees you with your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not his conscience be emboldened to eat things offered to idols? And so the weak brother for whom Christ died will be wasted because of your knowledge. But when you thus sin against the brothers and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So then, if food causes my brother to fall, I will never eat meat again, lest I cause my brother to fall. Back at the beginning of the chapter, Paul has been talking about things offered to idols. He's already said that idols are nothing, but the trouble is, of course, that the idols represent demons, and the demons are behind the idols. I have to comment a textual question in verse 7. I read some with consciousness of the idol. Instead of with consciousness, less than 5% of the Greek manuscripts have accustomed to the idol, followed by NIV, NASB, LB, so on, your modern versions. That is clearly an inferior proceeding, an inferior reading. The problem here is not because someone is accustomed to the idol. It's a problem of consciousness because of what happens, goes on to say. If just because he's accustomed to it, he's not going to be offended, he's not going to fall. It's not that, it's the consciousness of the idol. The weak brother, still thinks that idol is something. Verse 8 says, whether we eat, we're not better off. If we don't eat, we're not worse off. Obviously, that is spiritually speaking. It doesn't have anything to do with our physical bodies as such at that point. Now, depending on where you live, but in the United States, here in Brazil, not much and so on, there aren't any temples anymore with idols in them. In some parts of the world, there still are, Japan and where not. So depending on where you live, this could still be a problem. That is, having a temple with an idol in it, or some other such god, and where food is sold there. Nowadays, for those of us who live in the so-called first world, we don't understand how it was back 2,000 years ago. If you are traveling and you're in a strange place, you don't have family, you don't have a place to go, where are you going to eat? Well, for us nowadays, there's a lunch place almost anywhere you want to turn. Wasn't like that so long ago. I have traveled a great deal here in Brazil, and I have traveled in places that might say are backward or whatnot. Hey, you buy food on the street. You buy it where you can find it. And of course, in those days, where you could find it would be in a temple. I take it that the problem here is not what you eat at home where no one can see what you're doing. The problem is precisely you eating in the wrong place in the terms of someone whose conscience may be troubled or bothered by that. Actually, as a matter of fact, I would say that in general, even if you have knowledge and even if it's not a problem, it's for appearance's sake. It's probably better not to go eat in an idol's temple, even if it doesn't bother you. It's probably not just the best thing to do. The more so if there are other places where you can eat. So now we come to verse 13, which has sometimes been called the law of love. So then if food causes my brother to fall, I will never eat meat again, lest I cause my brother to fall. This is, we give up a right for the sake of a brother. Notice, though, however, the fall here is serious. There's the possibility the person is not going to be able to get up again. So this is not just any little old fall that's involved. Okay, let's go on now to chapter 9. And now Paul is going to carry on about the rights of an apostle, rights between. I'll read verses 1 through 10. It's chapter 9, verses 1 through 10. Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet at least I am to you, because you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who are judging me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, just as the rest of the apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to forego working? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who tends a flock and does not drink of its milk? I am not saying these things as a mere man, am I? Does not the law also say the same? For it stands written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox that is threshing. Is it really about the oxen that God is concerned? Or does he surely say it for our sakes? Yes, it was written for us, that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should partake of his hope. His hope, that is, of the one who is plowing. Okay, let's go back. Notice that the third thing he says here, have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Remember way back when Peter thought that he had to find a replacement for Judas Iscariot, Acts chapter 1, verse 22, one of the necessary qualifications was to be a witness of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And of course, if you Saul of Tarsus, he still was, but if he saw Jesus on the Damascus Road, obviously Jesus was resurrected. Because if Jesus was still in the tomb, he couldn't appear to anybody. He came back from heaven. So, in any case, Paul is pointing out that he meets that requirement too, as far as that goes. Although he was not around. He was around at the time, almost certainly, but would not have seen the risen Christ until the Damascus Road. Now, verse 5, he talks about having a believing wife. As I've already said before, I think, as a very devout, thoroughgoing Pharisee, he would almost certainly have been married. Pharisees had an obligation to marry. So he's probably now a widower. He talks here about the rest of the apostles and the Lord's brothers. That refers to the Lord's half-brothers, the sons that Mary had with Joseph after Jesus was born. Cephas was another name for Peter. Verse 6, is it only Barnabas and I? Now, you might have thought that way back when in the chapter 13 of Acts, when Paul and Barnabas had their spat about John, and one went one way and one went the other, that they never got together again. But I think that is probably a false notion. I think that after things calmed down, Paul and Barnabas had more work to do together. The fact is that Paul mentions him here as though being in the same boat with him, that is, they had to work with their own hands. Paul, as we know, made tents. We don't know what Barnabas may have done. But he goes on to say what is obvious. A soldier in those days did not serve at his own expense. Matter of fact, today, if you're a mercenary, whoever's paying you has to pay. But if you are a soldier with the government has to keep you alive. The government has to buy your food. You don't buy your own food. Whatever expenses a soldier has who's in active duty, it's the government who's taking care of it. So that should be quite obvious. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Only if you don't want to, I guess. Who tends a flock and does not drink of its milk? Now, the text actually says eat, not drink. But of course, milk is a liquid. On the other hand, Paul might have been thinking of cheese that is derived from milk, in which case eat would be the better word. You can change it that way if you like. He goes on to appeal to the law. You shall not muzzle an ox that is threshing. That is from Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 4. That's exactly what it says. Now, what he says here is that you really think that God is worried about the oxen. I would say that obviously human beings are more important to God than are the animals. But God is telling us to treat the animals with some consideration. That's the whole point. You shall not muzzle an ox that is threshing. You have to treat the ox with consideration. Not that the ox is better than we are, but I take it that God is saying we should not be cruel to animals and so on. They deserve some consideration, some respect. They also are God's creation, even if at a lower level. Verse 10 might not be totally obvious. He who threshes in hope should partake of his hope. That is to say, the guy who plowed. So the farmer plows and plants what he's expecting to receive a harvest. So he planted, let's say, wheat. So comes harvest time. If the owner himself may not do it, he may hire someone to do that, to do the threshing, the harvesting. And so the one who is hired, he is partaking in the hope of the owner. That is to say, he's going to get part of the result. Fair enough. Let's go on to verses 11 through 14. We're still in chapter 9. Since we planted spiritual things in you, is it a big deal if we reap material things from you? If others have a share in this right from you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but we put up with everything so as not to cause any hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the sacred things eat from the temple, and those who serve at the altar have a share in the altar? So also the Lord has instructed those who proclaim the gospel to live from the gospel. You and I might agree that there are those who have exaggerated a little bit about this reaping material. They just seem that some people, that's all they think about. But he is defending the fact that the more so if you have, say, a church has a pastor who is what we call the full time, that he's giving all his time to that. Well, then he doesn't have time to work some other way to earn his food, so you have to support him, obviously. And that is what normally happens in our churches. With reference to Paul, though, he often had to work with his hands, as indeed he did. He had the right to expect to receive food, whatnot, from the people, but he said he forewent it. He did not use it. So it's not to cause a hindrance. And he refers to the Old Testament. That was obvious. But what did Paul mean in verse 14? So also the Lord has instructed those who proclaim the gospel to live from the gospel. Well, where did the Lord do that? When was that? Well, when Jesus sent out the 12 and later the 70, he told them not to take money, but to depend on the hospitality of those to whom they ministered. But those occasions were, I think, rather short-lived, a case of a few weeks. In any case, in the upper room, that last night together, the Lord reversed that instruction. But in any case, the living has to do with basic needs, not luxury. God may permit someone to have luxury or comfort, but doesn't guarantee it. We don't have that right. I would say that just like a soldier, if anyone asks me what my relationship to Jesus is, I say that I'm a slave of Jesus. Okay, so if you're a slave, the owner has to take care of you, obviously. If an owner has a slave, that slave is supposed to work and so on, And if a slave is supposed to work, the owner has to keep him in reasonably good health and strength so that he can get all the advantage that he can out of the slave. Otherwise, what's the point in having a slave if you're going to let him die of hunger? So, one way or another, all depends on what your relationship to God is and what he tells you to do. One way or another, it is in God's interest to keep us alive as long as we are serving his purposes, which, however, is not a blank check. That doesn't mean that we can just sit around and do nothing. Now let's go on here to verses 15 through 18. Now I have not used any of these rights, nor have I written these things that it should be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. I cannot boast because I preach the gospel, because I am compelled to do so. Indeed, woe is me if I do not preach it. Open parenthesis, if I do this of my own volition, I have a reward. But if otherwise, I have been entrusted with a commission, close parenthesis. So what is my reward? That when I evangelize, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, so as not to use my rights in the gospel. Now let's think about it a minute. If you only do something because you are compelled, because you can't get out of it, you don't get any credit for it, right? Well, Paul preaches the gospel because he has to. He is compelled. Therefore, he gets no credit for just preaching the gospel. He has to do it. But Paul wants some credit. He wants some reward. So how can he get it? He can't get it by preaching, since that is obligatory. But he can get it by preaching without charge. Paul has the right to charge, but he forgoes that right so as to get some credit, some reward. Evidently, this was rather important to him, judging by verse 15. I confess that I don't understand why he said it would be better to die. He said that at the end of verse 15, better for me to die than. I confess that I don't understand that. Maybe he was just exaggerating a little bit, I just don't know. Okay, verses 19 through 23. Though being free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, in order that I might win the more. To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those under law as under law, that I might win those under law. To those without law as without law. Parenthesis, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, close parenthesis, that I might win those without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now I do this for the sake of the gospel, so as to become its partner. Well, you know, I think that this is more the case for evangelism, or in the case of a pioneer or missionary who's taking the gospel for the first time to a people who have never had it, as was the case for Paul. When we are discipling someone who is already born again, I take it this sort of thing doesn't work that well. That said, we cannot accommodate ourselves totally to whatever the people have that we are trying to reach, because in that case there's no point in going to them at all. We are taking the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that is a totally new worldview. We are taking a totally new culture. So if you acculturate totally, and you have nothing more to say. We have to understand this within its context. I was a pioneer missionary myself at one time. You just have to learn the language. The language is the key to their heart. And you have to learn the culture to the extent that you don't do unnecessary things that will just offend them or get you killed and so on and such. But that does not mean that you are agreeing with everything that they do. You have to understand what they do. Up to whatever point is necessary, as he said, he became weak to whoever was weak and so on and such. I take it that would only be during the evangelizing process, because once someone is being discipled, you are discipling the person within the doctrine of the faith. And that is contrary to their culture and so on and such. At least so it seems to me. Verse 23, I do this for the sake of the gospel so as to become its partner. Hey, if you are a partner, you get a share of the profits, all right? Evidently, Paul's share was being deposited in the bank of heaven, and that's the best place to do it, actually. In verse 24 through 27, which brings us to the end of chapter 9, Paul brings up a very serious point. Do you not know that in a stadium race, all the runners run, but one gets the prize? Run like that, so that you may win. All athletic competitors exercise general self-control. They do it in order to receive a perishable crown, but we an imperishable one. So that is how I run, with a definite goal. That is how I fight, with well-aimed blows. Yes, I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest, having preached to others, I myself should be rejected. Now, going back to verse 24, what he says, this is obvious in any athletic contest. Everyone is running, everyone wants to win, but only one person actually does win. But if you're going to be an athlete, and if you're going to compete in athletic competitions, you have got to keep your body, you have to train. And that involves general self-control. You just can't overindulge, you just can't do things that other people do, because you are really working to get your body in the best possible shape so that you can win if possible. And of course, in those days they did it for a perishable crown, but Paul says we do it for an imperishable one. And so he talks about running or fighting. He does it, he says, he knows what he's doing. He's not just thrashing around. Now notice verse 27. I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest having preached to others, I myself should be rejected. And that verb rejected is exactly that. It is a strong word. It's a strong term. You might say, well, come on, how could an apostle be rejected? Well, there it is. I have seen people who I thought were great servants of God go down the tube. They just turned their backs on God and threw it all away. Certainly they will be rejected. And notice that this has to do with his body. I discipline my body because often enough it's our bodies that get us into trouble. Our bodies have necessary desires, but if we overindulge or we indulge in the wrong way, we get into problems, including spiritual problems. Look, if Paul was worried about being rejected, I think maybe we had better give it a thought or two as well.